Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third and final session of the 2022 Winter Speaker Series presented by Glacier National Park Volunteer Associates. I'm Cheryl Klein. I'm the current president of the Associates, and I just want to give you a quick little introduction to our organization before I present our speaker. Glacier National Park Volunteer Associates is the only all-volunteer organization as a park partner to Glacier National Park. As the volunteer group, we are ready to step in for all sorts of jobs that do not have regular assigned employees, things that don't need a lot of skill, and other projects that come along that are needing done with little introduction. We have helped in the last couple years with the new ticketed entry system, which will be again in place this year. We work with research biologists. We work at the Nature Center, the visitor centers, backcountry permit office. Sometimes we fill in the office, and whatever else needs to be done. So right now I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, who is John Waller. He is the Carnivore Program Manager for Glacier National Park. He has held this position for 20 years. He knows all there is to know about bears in Glacier National Park and elsewhere, I assume. John received his bachelor's and PhD degree at the University of Montana in Missoula, and his master's degree in wildlife management at Montana State in Bozeman. So he has a well-rounded education. So I want to present to you John Waller, who's going to talk to you about angry bears tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Well, did you want to do makeup before we start? No makeup. I apologize for that. So, Bearmageddon. So, as everybody knows, Glacier National Park has been overrun with tourists over the past several years. The visitation's increased by leaps and bounds, and in the 20 years I've worked here, it's doubled, basically. So, what does that mean for bears? And so I'll go through and talk about some of those things. I guess to set the stage, most of you are probably familiar with what the entrance station looks like these days, but cars back up all the way to the highway. All the pullouts and popular stopping areas on the Going to Sun Road are packed with people, and you can't find a place to park. And it's a challenging environment for sure. And it wasn't always that way. You know, like I said, when I started, it was half the number of people that are in the park now. And if you go back to when the park was created, very few people were there. This is a picture from when I started at the park. But this is a graph of visitation. So it's recreation visits to the park by year, starting in 1911. And you can see that it's grown substantially. This goes up to 2020. But you can kind of see some highlights here. The Going to the Sun Road opened to the public in 1933. And then, of course, it went up quite a bit and sort of stabilized here at about 250,000 visitors. And then a big drop during World War II. People were busy doing other things. And then the post-war years, we saw this dramatic increase in park visitation, which really was system-wide. All the units, the National Park Service saw a lot of growth in those post-war years. And you see little hiccups along the way. Here was the '64 flood. People didn't show up, but then it kept climbing up and going up and up and up. This is the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Sun Road in 1983. That's when George and Barbara Bush visited the park, if any of you were around then. Then it kind of dipped and stabilized for a little bit, and then we saw this big jump in the run-up to the park centennial in 2010. Some of you might remember the Find Your Park campaign. It was obviously very successful because we just shot up to here, and then the pandemic hit, and then it shot back down, and then people decided they didn't like the pandemic, and it shot back up. So kind of an interesting graph to look at. And I just put, this is the U.S. population growth rate over that period of time. Of course, it's by decade here, but you can see that the growth in park visitation is more or less tracked U.S. population growth. So I guess it's kind of what you expect. More people in the country, more people visiting the parks. And of course, the Sun Road is super busy and lots of cars and lots of people, but what does that mean for trail use? Are all those people going on the trails? And that relates to what, to how bears respond. And we have been monitoring trail use in the park for a number of years. So here's 5 years of data looking at some selected trails in the park. And you can see the growth isn't quite as dramatic as it is for the road or for total visits. This is the loop trail here. It's been relatively stable. The avalanche trail is kind of going up fairly steadily. But if you look at the actual counts, that's a little more dramatic. So these are all the trails that we had counters on. And these are the minimum and maximum counts. And of course, the maximums are what I always look at. Avalanche Lake Trail is the most popular trail in the park, and almost 2,400 hikers. This is for last year. Hidden Lake, second most popular, close to 2,400. Loop trails down around 1,500. If you want some solitude in the park, I guess it looks like maybe the Red Eagle Trail is the place you want to go. 26 at a maximum, and the average was 12. So I guess there's something for everybody there. And the distribution of those counts in that chart that we just looked like, all those trails for the most part have a more or less normal distribution, something similar to this, where the most hikers are during the middle of the day and drop off in the early morning and late evening hours. Not a lot of nighttime hiking going on. And the parks worked really hard to try and manage visitor expectations. We're saying, this is what you see on Instagram, but that's not what you're going to find when you get here. It's going to be pretty crowded. So be patient and have contingency plans for your visit. But what does that mean for bears? With all these people on the trails, are bears going to be able to get out of people's way, or people, how's that going to play out? And fortunately, what we've seen is that people are pretty good about getting out of the way of bears, like this family on Swift Current Pass Trail, getting out of the way of this family of bears. Some of you might have seen this photograph that Philip Granrud took where this guy climbed out off the rim rocks to make way for this bear coming through. But it's not always the case. A lot of times people get too close to bears. This is the boardwalk at Logan Pass. You see the bear? Mm-hmm. Yeah, right there in the middle. These people are heading off the trail to get a closer look. So that's not good. So if we look at the amount of maulings, that's what everybody's interested in, right? How many people are getting munched by bears every year? So this is a graph where I plotted the number of bear mauling victims by decade per 100,000 recreation visits. So this green line is the number of recreation visits. This is by decade. So 10-year chunks from the start of the park to the last decade, 2010 to 2020. And what we see is that there were no injuries in the park until about 1920, and then it climbed up pretty dramatically up into the 1930s and 1940s. So this is the period when we were seeing a lot of growth. People were getting cars and driving to the park and feeding bears. And it continued to climb up until, it reached the peak at around in the 1950s, and then declined slightly. But the 50s and 60s were pretty rough years for visitors. They were getting munched quite a bit. And then right around here, what happened? Anybody remember?
Control of garbage.
The night of the grizzlies. Bearmageddon. The people got munched, and that really changed how the Park Service managed bears. And we tolerated a lot of bear feeding and close interactions with bears. And after that night in 1967, we changed our management, and we saw that injuries really dropped off after that, and kind of stabilized during the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, and then it made another big drop into the 2000s. And then this is right about where I started working the part, right there. And of course it dropped off even further, so thanks to me. So this is the same graph. I just threw on this purple line, which is the proportion of grizzly bears involved in causing these injuries. And as you can see from from 1920 all the way up until around 1970, less than a quarter of injuries were caused by grizzly bears. So it was all black bears biting people, really. But then after that, the proportion really went up until today. Almost all of the injuries are caused by grizzly bears. This graph, this is a total count by decade of the number of mauling victims and the number of fatalities in the orange, which is really small. But also this blue column, these are the numbers of bears that we've had to destroy for management purposes because they've been causing trouble. And so you can see in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of bears removed, but then it dropped down steadily, as did the injuries and the fatalities, up till today. So now we're removing, what is this? That's the 5 line. So, we're removing less than 10 bears a decade, so less than 1 per year, which is pretty good. And we haven't had a fatality since 1998 was the last bear-caused human fatality in the park. And likewise, human injuries have been decreasing too. So we're down to less than 1 injury per decade. So is that Bearmageddon? Is that kind of what you're thinking should happen with all these people? I mean, how do the bears stand having all those people out there?
They learn to stay away.
Well, you're right. That's exactly right. They learn to stay away from people. Bears are really smart, adaptable animals, and they're generally peaceable animals. From what I've seen, when a bear attacks a person, it's pretty traumatic for the bear. I don't think people think about that, but I mean, that's a very stressful situation for a bear to get involved with a fight with a person. And then there's another number of other reasons. One is education. Across the country, there's been a really concerted effort to educate people on how to live with bears and what you should and shouldn't do, and that's really helped a lot. And certainly that's been the case in Glacier. Another one's sanitation. Up until the night of the grizzlies in '67, we had open garbage dumps, in places like Granite Park and Sperry Chalet, and people would watch bears feed in the garbage. And
Evening entertainment.
Yep, that was the evening entertainment. And we learned through time that that's not a good way to treat bears, and it's asking for trouble. So our sanitation efforts, these are the cans that we use in the park, and we don't use non-bear-proof garbage cans anymore. So we try and keep all the food and garbage away from bears, and we work real hard to make sure that stays that way. I think another thing that's been really important is bear spray. A pretty good proportion of park visitors now carry bear spray when they're hiking, and we don't have good numbers on it because, of course, everybody doesn't report it when they spray a bear, but we know at least several times a year people are spraying attacking bears. And the beauty of that is that the bear learns a lesson. If you shoot a bear in the head when it charges you, that's not a lesson for a bear, right? But if they get bear sprayed and it's unpleasant for the bear learns that maybe next time I won't come charging after this person. And bears are generational learners, so they teach their cubs. And so you start getting this knowledge passed from generation to generation of bears to leave people alone. I think that's been a lot more influential than what we know. And the other thing is our management's changed quite a bit too. We spend a lot of time hazing and aversive conditioning bears to basically teach them not to fear people, but to fear making bad choices. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Bears, there's this is at Ptarmigan Falls. This is a female with 2 cubs, and she's been exposed to a lot of people year after year after year, and so she's pretty comfortable around people. And here she is sniffing some packs. And these people backed away with their cameras. They left their bear spray here.
I was going to say, there's a bear spray in the rocks.
Yeah. They should have had it with them, but for a bear manager, this is a emergent problem. So in the past, we probably would have ignored that, not thinking there's not much we could do about it. But in this particular case, we actually went in, we trapped this bear, radio collared her, and assigned people to basically babysit her. And when she did something like this, when she came around people, we were there waiting for her to scare away. And so you do this repeatedly, and then she learns that that's not a behavior that we'll tolerate. If bears get food, in that previous picture, that bear didn't get into those packs, but we've certainly seen instances where bears have obtained food and become pretty aggressive about going after it. This is a grizzly bear at the Many Glacier Auto Campground a couple years ago. And there were people yelling at that bear when this picture was taken, and the bear's, come on, bring it. And nobody did. And we never did catch up to this bear. I mean, we tried, we put a trap out, we had rangers chase it out, but we would have trapped and killed this bear had it availed itself to do it, but we never did. But this is a very dangerous behavior. I mean, that's a bear that's becoming a threat to public safety. And it sounds harsh to say, well, we would capture it and kill it or send it to a zoo, but by doing that, we prevent future problems. So that the plus side of that is, if you remember that graph with the blue columns I showed before, we hardly ever move bears anymore. We haven't removed a grizzly bear since 2009. And, for black bears, we're just, I think our long-term average now is about 2 per year, which is pretty good considering we've got a big population of bears. We have about 1,000 bears in the park.
How often do you actually send them to zoos, or rather than euthanize them?
It depends. The problem with zoos is that bears live a long time, right? And the number of zoos doesn't really change that much. So once a zoo gets a bear, they've got them for a long time. So there's not always a lot of places. If there's openings, we will send them to zoos.
So that sounds good, but it doesn't happen.
It just doesn't always work out. I mean, we certainly make an effort to do that. But the reality is that there's more problem bears than there are places in zoos. When we do detect a problem, we try and be proactive. We warn the public. We'll close trails or campgrounds if it's necessary. And then we'll assign people to go in and take care of the problem, whatever it might be. If it's a habituated or a food conditioned bear, we'll deal with it depending on the circumstances. But this is a picture from, I don't know if any of you remember the Old Man Lake bear. She was a bear that would always come into the campground at Old Man Lake, and we radio collared her and assigned these people. They had bear dogs. This is actually a contractor that we hired specifically to do that with dogs, and sent crew of rangers out and just tried to be there whenever she made a misstep. We'd try and correct that behavior. Relocation used to be kind of the tool of choice. So if we had a bear show up in a campground, we set a trap and move it to some other place in the park. And that was sort of the go-to management method right through the 1980s, really. And what we learned through time with radio collars is it's not particularly successful. You can't move them far enough, really. Glacier Park's not big enough to translocate grizzly bears, barely big enough to translocate black bears. But really, it's much more effective to teach them the errors of their way in the place they live. I mean, you can catch them and move them into some strange place they've never been before, but it's hard on the bears. The lesson is always not quite so clear for them. So if you can catch a bear in a campground and tag it and then let it go in the campground and let it out of the trap and then chase it out of the campground, it learns a lot more from that experience than it does just getting dumped out in some other part of the park. This is bear 324, a sow with their cub that were regular frequent visitors to the Rising Sun campground, and got to be where they were really getting to be a problem. In fact, the day I set this trap, I was kind of shepherding them through the campground, and this little cub jumped on a tent right in front of me. So, I mean, it's time for something to happen there. So let's go back and look at that graph again. I mean, what do we expect to happen here going forward? You know, are we going to see Bearmageddon happen? You know, we looked at this graph of visitation and human or U.S. population growth. This population growth is expected to continue at about the same slope as this line, about 2% per year through 2060. So extrapolating forward, you know, we're just going to see more people, and if this relationship between visitation and population continues, we're going to continue to see growth in the park, you know, barring unforeseen things like war, famine, or disease. But what's the likelihood of that to happen? And again, what do we expect to see in terms of our injury rates? You know, we know visitation is probably going to keep going up. What's this line going to do? Are we going to see it continuing to go to zero? If I have to speculate, I think we might continue to see some minor declines. We're already getting pretty close to zero, but bear attacks are kind of like lightning. They will always happen just because that's the way life is. You get 3 million people mixing it up with 1,000 bears, you know, eventually somebody's going to get killed. That's just unavoidable. But it becomes just kind of a random event. It's not really predictable. I mean, you do the best job you can, but at some point, somebody's going to do something dumb. But it's good to keep that in perspective. This is the graph I got online. It's called the bubbles of death, but it just shows you the odds of dying of different causes. You know, your overall odds of dying are 1 in 1, right? None of us are getting out of here alive. But, you know, you've got a 1 in 7 chance of dying of cancer. But in Glacier Park, these are the top causes of death in the park. These numbers are a little dated, but 2015 numbers, I think. But it gives you an idea where death by bear sits on the scale of what people die of in the park. I mean, you've got if you look at the total number of human fatalities in the park, divided by the cumulative visitation, and you've got about a 1 in 11 million chance of dying by a grizzly bear in the park. So I hope that doesn't keep you up at night. You know, showed that graph of lightning. You've got a 1 in 79,000 chance of getting hit by lightning. And it also kind of depends what people do. You know, we've got a huge population increase in the Flathead Valley now. We've got kind of this outdoor ethic that's developing where people go out, not just to enjoy the outdoors and to recreate, but to participate in athletic pursuits. It's kind of the nature is my gym sort of mentality, where the wilderness is where I go to work out. And a lot of times that means doing stuff at speed, trail running, mountain biking, you know, high elevation snowmobiling. It's putting people in places where bears are. And it increases the chances of encountering bears in negative circumstances. And, you know, fortunately, you know, snowmobiling and mountain biking don't happen in the park, but certainly you see trail runners. You know, we try and discourage that, but it's not against the rules. But you've seen some of the impact of that outside the park where it is allowed. You know, we've had a couple cyclists killed in the last few years. We had a trail runner collide with the grizzly bear at Huckleberry Lookout, you know, and so I think if people keep pursuing those activities, I think we might see some bad stuff happen just because of that. But I'll leave you with this bear safety tip, and that concludes my presentation. I hope you found it informative, and come to Glacier, but be safe. Thank you.